Snow had been falling since before daybreak, fine as sifted flour and just as relentless. By late afternoon, the drifts had swallowed half the split rail fence that circled Alan's lonely homestead on the northern frontier. The cold was the sort that settled deep in the bones, the kind no fear would chase away once it took hold. Inside the small cabin, Alan Hart, 25, widowed long before her time, sat beside the hearth. Her hands wrapped around a tin cup of weak coffee gone cold. The flames flickered against her pale face, lighting the shadows under her eyes. She had not slept well in months. Not since the day soldiers rode in with a folded flag, and the news that her husband Nada had fallen in a border skirmish far from home. Today should have been a day of joy. Christmas Eve and her own birthday, though she had almost forgotten until morning light, reminded her of the date carved on the frame of the little mirror her husband once polished each year. But there were no gifts now, no footsteps outside, no laughter, no warmth, nothing but wind, snow, and a silence too heavy for any young widow to carry alone. Alan rose from her chair, walked to the single small window, and brushed frost from the glass. Beyond it lay a world of white emptiness, the kind that made a person feel small, in ways words couldn't capture. It was the kind of night where no one would come knocking. She reached for a candle, set it in the window, a habit from childhood, meant to guide any wandering soul home on Christmas Eve. She did not expect it to mean anything tonight. She lit it anyway. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. It drifted between memories. She tried and failed to bury Natara's voice, his smile, his promise. Next Christmas, sweetheart. We fill this place with music. A promise broken by fate. And then, thump, thump, thump. A hard, urgent knocking shook the cabin door. Ellen flinched so sharply she nearly spilled her cup. She froze, heart thundering. No one came out here in a storm, not, unless something terrible had happened. Another knock, louder this time. The wind howled through the chinks, pushing snow under the door. Elaine reached for the rifle above the mantel, more for courage than intent. She stepped to the door, her breath trembling in her chest. "Who's there?" she called. A voice strained and hoarse answered through the wind. "Please, I need shelter." Ellen hesitated only a moment before unbolting the door. It flew inward with the storm, and a blast of snow struck her full in the face. Through the white swirl stood a man tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a worn buffalo hide. His dark hair, long and braided in a patchy fashion, was stiff with ice. His lips were blue, his breath ragged, but his eyes dark, sharp, startlingly handsome, held both exhaustion and something softer, something human. "Ma'am," he rasped, "I won't trouble you long. I only ask for a fire to keep me alive till the storm eases." Ellen's instincts whirred within her. She should refuse. She lived alone. The frontier was dangerous. But there was a look in the man's eyes that reminded her of a time before grief. A time when she still believed strangers might bring something good. "Come in," she said quietly. "Before you freeze solid." He stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. She shut the door hard behind them, sealing out the cold. The man stood uncertainly near the hearth, as though unsure he belonged this close to warmth. Elaine set her rifle aside and offered him a tin cup of hot water. "It's all I have right now. I wasn't planning much of a supper." He smiled faintly as he wrapped his hand around the cup. "Thank you. I'm Daniel." His voice was deeper than she expected. Gentle, low, carrying the cadence of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. "You can stay," Alan said. "Until the snow lets up." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, long enough for the firelight to catch the bronze in his cheekbones and the quiet gratitude in his eyes. "If I could choose," he said softly, "I'd stay longer than that." Ellen blinked, startled by the warmth rising to her face. She turned away quickly, pretending to busy herself with the iron kettle. "I guess," she murmured. "This Christmas Eve won't be so lonely after all." She carved what was left of a roasted chicken, a bird she'd meant to stretch for days, and set it between them on the small table. Daniel hesitated before taking a piece, as though unused to being welcomed at any table not his own. The wind beat the walls, but inside the fire glowed, turning the shadows into golden pools of quiet comfort. Daniel ate slowly, savoring each bite. Elaine watched him, curiosity stirring through her grief like a spark under ashes. After a while, Daniel spoke, his voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "You said you lost someone." Elaine set her fork down, her throat tightened. "My husband," she whispered. "Just a few months ago. It was only 30. Daniel's gaze lowered. Pain flickered across his eyes, so pain she did not understand. "I'm sorry," he said. "A man should grow old beside the woman he loves." She swallowed hard. "We didn't get the chance." Daniel stared into the flames, his jaw tense as though he carried ghosts of his own. "Sometimes," he murmured, "those we lose guide us in ways we don't expect." Elaine frowned slightly. "You say that like you know." Daniel lifted his eyes to hers, full of secrets, full of something he wasn't ready to speak. "Maybe I do," he said. Outside the storm raged. Inside, for the first time in months, Elaine felt the faint stirrings of warmth, not just from the fire, but from the presence of the stranger who had come knocking on the loneliest night of her life. Ayn woke the next morning to a stillness so complete, she thought, for a disoriented moment that the world outside had frozen solid. The cabin was warm, warmer than she remembered leaving it. Something smelled good, though. Savory, comforting. She blinked sleep from her eyes, pushed aside the heavy wool blanket, and stepped into the main room. Daniel was there, already awake, already working. He stood over the cast iron pot on the stove, steam curling around his face. He turned at the sound of her footsteps. A gentle smile lit his features, softening the hard lines carved by wind and war. "Morning," he said. "I hope you don't mind. I found the chicken bones from last night. Thought I'd turn them into soup." Aileen stopped in the doorway for a heartbeat. Long hair. Maybe she forgot how to breathe. Because Daniel standing there stirring a pot at dawn. Because the smell of warm broth filling the cabin. Because the sight of a man readying breakfast while the world outside was nothing but snow. It was too familiar, too tender, too much like him. Her husband, Natada, had done that exact thing every winter morning. Her voice wavered. "Do you remind me of him? My husband." He used to wake early, and she stopped, swallowing hard. The memory pressed too sharp against her ribs. "Cook breakfast." Daniel's smile softened with something deeper understanding. "Maybe your sorrow." "Then maybe," he said quietly. "It brought me here." Elaine looked up sharply, startled by the certainty in his tone. "What do you mean?" Daniel shrugged one broad shoulder, stirring the broth with slow, sure movements. "Some men love so strong. It doesn't end when their breath does. Sometimes it pushes the living along paths they never meant to take." Elaine wrapped her arms around herself. "You talk like you've lost someone, though." His hand stilled on the wooden spoon. For a moment, he didn't answer. "Then, everyone loses someone," he said softly. "Some losses carve deeper than others." She didn't press. Something in his voice warned her that pushing might crack open wounds far older than hers. The soup began to bubble. Daniel ladled a portion into a wooden bowl and handed it to her. His fingers brushed hers warm and calloused. "Eat," he said. "It'll help." Ella lowered herself to the table. The first sip burned her tongue, but its warmth spread through her chest like a small sun. Easy." Daniel sat across from her with his own bowl. A snow light spilled through the frosted window, pale and blue, casting them both in a quiet glow. "Thank you," she murmured. "For what?" "For these. For cooking? For being here." "I didn't think anyone would knock on my door again." Daniel looked at her with an expression she couldn't size up for. "I'm glad I did." They ate in a hush, broken only by the wind brushing against the cabin walls. It was an uncomfortable silence, more like the calm that settled after a storm had cried out its worst. When they finished, Daniel carried the bowls to the wash basin. Elaine watched him, her heart tugging in ways that frightened her. She shouldn't feel this lightness, this flicker of hope. Not yet. Not so soon. But Daniel, with his quiet hands and gentle eyes, made the loneliness in her chest shift in a way she hadn't expected. I set the bowls aside. If you've got chores, I can lend a hand. You don't have to, she said automatically. I know, he replied. But I want to. So she handed him a shovel, and together they worked through the morning, clearing snow from the porch and digging a path to the woodshed. Daniel moved with smooth, practiced motions, strong as a man, used to hard miles and harsher winters. When he smiled, that quiet, honest, it made the cold seem less biting. By midday, the sky had brightened enough to show the range of hills beyond the cabin. A band of deer picked its way along the ridge. Daniel paused to watch them, the wind tugging strands of his dark hair free from their braid. You have a beautiful place, he murmured. Eileen followed his gaze. It was supposed to be our beginning, she whispered. Mine and not us. Daniel didn't look away from the hills. Beginnings take many forms. She felt heat rise in her chest, not anger, not grief, something gentler, something terrifying. Inside again, they warmed their hands by the stove. Daniel leaned bow against the wall, arms crossed loosely over his chest. The firelight painted him in amber hues. Do you miss him every day? He asked. Yes, she said. But some days hurt more than others. Daniel nodded slowly. And today, she hesitated, her heart stumbled. Today hurts less. She saw his breath catch only slightly, but enough to notice. And when their eyes met, something unspoken moved between them, fragile as a snowflake, dangerous as a spark. The afternoon slipped into evening. They prepared supper together, bumping elbows, sharing small smiles. When Daniel reached over her to grab a jar, his arm brushed her shoulder. She didn't step away. Later, they sat beside the fireplace. A lamp glowed on the table. Daniel stretched his legs, boots crossed at the ankles, looking more at ease than he had since arriving. Where were you headed before the storm? Eileen asked. He considered the question long enough that she worried he'd refuse to answer. North, he said finally, trying to keep a promise. What kind of promise? Daniel's gaze drifted to the fire. For a heartbeat, he looked carved from sorrow. The kind of man doesn't break, he said, even if it costs him. She felt a shiver pass through her. Not from cold. There was a secret in him, a truth curled like a sleeping animal under his ribs. And though she didn't yet know what it was, she felt deep in her bones that when it surfaced, it would change everything. But tonight, beside the fire, with the storm quieting outside and their hearts beating closer than either intended, she let the secret stay where it was because Daniel was smiling at her. And for the first time since burying her husband, Eileen felt a laugh. The storm broke 2 days later, leaving the world outside washed in blinding white. The drifts piled waist deep around the cabin, and every branch glittered under a sun that felt too cold to warm anything but the scale. Inside, however, life had fallen into a rhythm of quiet, a quiet rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. Daniel brought in wood each morning, shaking snow from his shoulders as he crossed the threshold. Elaine cooked small meals, simple things, broth and bread, and the last of the dried apples. Sometimes she caught him watching her, his gaze soft, almost reverent, as though he were memorizing every movement. She didn't mind it. She didn't fear it. Not anymore. Something warm had settled between them. An unspoken thread woven from shared mornings, quiet laughter, and the way their hands brushed without pulling away. But fragile things have a way of shattering the moment. One believes they're safe. It happened late in the afternoon. Ella was tidying the cabin while Daniel chopped wood outside. A ribbon of sunlight slipped across the floorboards, warming her bare feet as she moved about the room. She lifted Daniel's buffalo hide coat from a chair, meaning to hang it so it wouldn't collect more snow melt. The coat was heavier than she expected. As she shook it out, something thumped against the inside lining, a soft folded weight. Curious, she reached into the inner pocket. Her fingers brushed paper. Old paper creased, worn, stiff with age. Eileen frowned and pulled it free. A letter. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Her breath caught in her throat. Nada. Claire's throat. Her husband's script steady, slanted just so, the way he wrote when he hurried, but still wanted the lines to look neat for her sake. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The edges were worn, the creases deep, as though it had been opened and closed many times on a long, hard trail. The words blurred for a moment before they sharpened, cutting straight into her chest. Daniel, if you're reading this, then I did not make it home. I ask you, friend, go to my wife. Don't leave her to face this world alone. She is strong, but even strong hearts break. Take care of her. Help her live the life I won't be there to give. I trust you more than any man. Nata. A coldness spread through her colder than any wind outside. Her legs weakened and she sank onto the edge of the bed, the letter fluttering in her hands. The room dimmed around her, the fire's crackle fading into nothing. Daniel knew nada. Daniel knew him well enough to be entrusted with this the sacred unbearable request. Daniel had come here because of her husband, not because fate had carried him to her door, not because he chose her. The realization tore through her chest with a sharp, bitter edge. The door opened behind her, letting in a rush of crisp air. Snow fell from Daniel's boots as he stepped inside, rubbing warmth back into his hands. Chilly out there, he said, shaking stray flakes from his hair. But the path to the creek's clear now. We have water again. Elaine didn't move. Didn't they speak? She held the letter like a blade. Daniel noticed her silence and paused. His brow furrowed. Eileen. Everything all right? She lifted her head slowly. Her eyes met his and for the first time he flinched because there was no warmth in her gaze now. No trust. Only hurt. You knew him, she whispered. You knew nada. Daniel froze where he stood, all color drained from his face. Ellen, he breathed, voice tight. She stood holding the letter out toward him. You came here because of this. Her voice cracked. Not because of me. Daniel's jaw clenched. He stepped forward instinctively, but she recoiled as though the very sight of him burned. I meant to tell you, he said quickly. I meant to. When, she demanded. When were you going to tell me? After you won my trust. After you shared my bed. After I gave you pieces of myself I didn't even know how to give again. Daniel shut his eyes, shoulders sagging. I never meant to lie to you. You lied the moment you walked through that door. She shot back. His voice broke. Ellen, what we have, it's real. Real? Her laughter came out like a sob. How can anything be real when it began with a lie? When you were following orders from a dead man. Daniel stepped closer again, his face raw with emotion. I loved him. Natada was my friend. I tried to save him. I failed and the last thing he asked of me was to care for you. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being a promise and became something else. Something I didn't expect. Something I couldn't stop. Her throat tightened. I can't. She shook her head, tears spilling fast now. I can't look at you without seeing what you hid from me. Daniel swallowed hard. Please, just let me explain. No. The word snapped through the cabin like a whip. She pointed to the door. Pack your things and leave my house. Daniel stood there breathing hard as though the world had struck him square in the chest. Ellen, I love you. Get out, she whispered. Before I start to hate you. Something in him broke. Then she saw the moment his heart folded under the weight of his own guilt. He gathered his few belongings in silence, each movement slow, deliberate, painful. When he reached the door, he hesitated. A snow whirled behind him, the wind tugging at his coat. Under his breath, barely audible, he murmured, Nata, I'm sorry I couldn't keep your promise. Then he stepped out into the cold. The door shut behind him with a hollow finality that echoed through every beam of the small cabin. And Eileen, standing alone with the letter trembling in her hand, felt her heart break for the second time in one lifetime. The hours after Daniel left, passed like slow-moving ghosts, chappies, cold. Unwilling to leave her beast as snow blew hard against the windows, rattling the panes. But the cabin felt colder than the storm outside. Eileen sat on the edge of her bed, the letter still in her trembling hands. She read it once more, hoping, praying it might say something different this time. But the ink did not change. Help her live the life I won't be there to give. Take care of her. She crushed the paper against her chest as if trying to push the words back into the past where they belonged. Her breath came in shallow bursts. Why had Nada chosen Daniel? Why had Daniel said nothing? Why had she let herself fall for a man carrying another man's promise? Grief and anger tangled inside her until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The cabin felt unfamiliar without Daniel's presence, the lingering echo of his footsteps, the memory of his low laugh, the chair he always pulled closer to the fire. She stared at the coat he had left behind by accident, a simple garment worn at the cuffs. But in the empty room, it looked like the ghost of a life she could have had. Night fell early. A thick electric darkness pressed against the walls. The storm had grown into a full blizzard by sundown. Elaine tried to busy herself mending a torn hem, sweeping the floor, feeding the fire, but every chore only reminded her of Daniel, of the way he had moved around her kitchen, Claire's throat, like he'd lived there all his life, of the gentle brush of his hand against hers, of the warmth his presence brought, deep as the warmth a person carried in their heart long before touching the skin. She forced herself into bed, but sleep would not come. The wind howled like a wounded thing. Shadows crawled across the walls. Her thoughts twisted back to the morning she first saw Daniel, half frozen on her porch, asking only for a place to warm his bones. She'd opened her door because of mercy, nothing more. So how had mercy become longing? How had longing become love? Her fist tightened around the blanket. Elite, she whispered into the dark. He lied to me. But another voice's mare rose underneath the anger. He also loved you. He tried to tell you. He didn't stay because of a promise. He stayed because of you. She rolled onto her side, pressing her face into the pillow. The scent of pine smoke clung to the fabric Daniel sent. It broke her completely. A sob tore from her chest. Then another. She hadn't cried like this even when Navidad had died. Maybe because then shock had numbed her. But now she was alive again. Alive enough to hurt. Alive enough to mourn. Hours later, the storm outside grew violent. Rain mixed with SLE hammered the cabin roof. Thunder cracked across the plains, shaking the window panes. Eileen jerked upright, her heart pounding. A single word ripped from her throat. Daniel. Her own voice startled her. The cabin answered only with the roar of the storm. Her breath trembled. She looked around the room. Empty bed, empty chair, empty doorway. The absence of him pressed so hard against her ribs she thought she might break under it. She stumbled to her feet and paced the room, clutching at her shawl. Daniel, she whispered again, softer this time, almost a prayer. Why did you leave so easily? Why did I make you go? Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the folded letter on the table. Eileen stared at it, her chest constricting. Nata. Her voice cracked. Why did you choose him? Why did you send him to me? For the first time since reading the letter, she let herself imagine the truth not as betrayal, but as a gift, a final act of love from the man she'd lost, a way of guiding her towards something new. When her own strength failed slowly, she sank into a chair, pressing her hands to her eyes. I'm not angry because he lied, she realized. I'm angry because I care. I'm angry because losing him hurts. When realization hit, it hit hard. A raw, relentless truth. She didn't want Daniel gone. She wanted him back. The storm outside began to ease near dawn, its fury softening into scattered rain. Eileen opened the door and stared into the gray horizon. The world smelled of wet earth and pine. The morning was quiet, too quiet. Daniel was somewhere out there alone, walking through the rain, through the cold, carrying guilt that wasn't his to carry. She felt something fierce unfurl inside her. A courage she hadn't known since the day Nada left home for war. I can't let him go, she whispered. The decision rose within her, steady as sun. She would find him. She would tell him the truth of her heart. She would not lose a second man to the silence between words. Eileen packed her saddlebags with what little food she had left and filled her canteen. She strapped on her boots, pulled her coat tight, and stepped outside. The ground squelched beneath her feet. Patches of mud mixed with slush made the path uneven. Determination straightened her spine. She saddled her horse and swung up with more resolve than strength. The wind whipped across the plain, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a guide. She glanced back at the cabin's mall, lonely, no longer a prison, but a place she would return to only when her heart was whole again. "Daniel," she murmured, gripping the rest. "Wherever you are, wait for me." Then she kicked gently, and her horse burst into motion, carrying her toward the Apache land, toward the men she had driven away, and the love she refused to lose again. The prairie opened before Elin in long ribbons of gray and silver, still wet from the night storm. Low clouds crawled across the sky, heavy and brooding, but the wind had eased to a quiet murmur. Her horse's hooves splashed through shallow puddles, scattering muddy water over the frost-bitten grass. She had never ridden this far alone, never beyond the ridge that separated her homestead from the outer territories. But today, the land didn't frighten her. The emptiness gave her direction. The wind gave her purpose. And Daniel somewhere ahead gave her strength. Hours passed. The plains shifted into rocky terrain, dotted with juniper and low cedar. She followed faint tracks along a narrow trail. Every now and then, she spotted a broken twig, a boot print softened by rain, a scrap of buffalo hide snagged on a thorn bush. Was it Daniel's? She didn't know, but she followed them anyway, trusting a pull stronger than logic. By noon, her hands were numb on the reins, and her horse snorted steam into the cool air. Elin rested him by a creek, crouching beside the water to drink. Her reflection stared back at her, tired, determined, strewn with dried tears. "Hold on," she whispered to the image. "Just a little longer." A rustling noise snapped her upright. Obvious, voices coming from the slope beyond the creek. Elin's pulse raced. She stepped back, uncertain whether to run or call out. 3 riders appeared at the top of the rise. Apache scouts, lean and watchful, wearing woven headbands and buckskin. They saw her instantly. One raised a hand. "Did she? Who are you?" Eileen swallowed her fear. "I'm looking for a man named Daniel," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Tall, strong, Apache." It would have come this way. The riders exchanged glances. Then the oldest of them pointed down the trail. "Go," he said in accented English. "Our village is close. The elder woman at Sasha may know him." Before she could thank them, the scouts kicked their mustangs and disappeared behind the ridge like spirits swallowed by Sta. The journey from there grew harder. The path wound upward between red cliffs and patches of stubborn pine. Loose gravel slid beneath her boots when she dismounted to lead her horse along the narrowest stretches. But she pushed onward, her breath coming thick and hard in the thin mountain air. By mid-afternoon, smoke curled in the distance, thin gray threads rising from the valley below. Her heart leaped. A village. Apache lodges shaped like rounded cones dotted the clearing. Their hides painted with earth-red symbols. Children played near the creek. Dogs barked at her approach. Women carrying baskets of herbs watched her with cautious curiosity. Eileen slowed her steps, aware she was a stranger in a place that held memories older than anything she could imagine. An elderly woman approached her, hair long in silver, her eyes deep as old riverbanks. "You come far," the woman said. "Why?" Elaine's throat tightened. "I'm looking for a man named Daniel. He left my home yesterday." At the name, something softened in the Alice's expression. "Ah, she," Claire's throat murmured. "The quiet one, the one with heavy heart." Eileen nodded, fighting the sting behind her eyes. "Please, I need to find him." The elder pointed toward the backside of the village where a line of tall pines leaned over a sloped clearing. "He works with wood today. Means shelters. He tries to forget the storm inside him." A grateful breath escaped the land. "Thank you. Thank you." The elder smiled gently. "Go bring him peace." Eileen followed the path around the pines. The ground dipped into a hollow where sunlight spilled like honey across piles of cut timber. And there alone, beside a split logs, stood Daniel. His back was to her. He swung an axe in smooth, powerful arcs, muscles pulling under his shirt, breath steady. Movements practiced. A small pile of shavings lay at his feet, half soaked with rain. For a moment, she could only watch him. Her heart clenched painfully in longing. Relief, something fierce and overwhelming. It looked so strong, yet so impossibly alone. She stepped forward. A twig snapped beneath her boot. Daniel froze. The axe slipped from his hand and thudded it into the dirt. It turned. When his eyes met hers, every ounce of color drained from his face. Eileen, he whispered as though saying her name hurt. What? What are you doing here? She didn't answer at first. Her breath hitched. Then, almost without thinking, she ran to him, closing the distance in a blur of emotion. She threw her arms around him. Daniel caught her instinctively, his hands gripping her back, pulling her tight against him with a desperation that poured from every trembling breath. You came all this way, he murmured, voice squeaking. Yes, she sobbed. I had to. Daniel, I'm so sorry. He shouldn't have sent you away. He shouldn't have. He pressed his forehead to hers, shaking his head. Eileen, no, I should have told you. He should have never hidden Nada's letter. I didn't want my promise to him to steal anything from what we'd be. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She cupped his face between her hands. I don't care how it started, she said. I care that I love you and that I can't live with myself knowing I let you walk away. Daniel's breath shuddered. I thought I'd lost you forever. No, she whispered. You could never lose me. Not now. He gathered her into his arms against all, steady trembling. Their lips met in a kiss that was both apology and forgiveness, both reunion and promise. A kiss deep enough to silence every doubt, every fear, every shadow. When they finally parted, Daniel touched her cheek gently, reverently. How did you find me? Eileen smiled through tears. Love showed me the way. Daniel let out a soft, stunned laugh, the kind she had longed to hear again. I don't deserve you. You deserve every good thing, she whispered. And I'm staying if you'll have me. He pulled her close once more, holding her as though anchoring himself to something solid for the first time in years. Eileen, he said so softly, you're the only home I've ever wanted. Around them, the pines swayed in a cold breeze. Far below, the village murmured with quiet laugh. But in that sunlit hollow, wrapped in each other's arms, the world felt still, like the winter had finally loosened its grip, and spring had dared to bloom in its place. Winter returned to the Apache Valley like a familiar old friend. Soft at first, then steady enough to frost the pines and dust the rooftops with white. Smoke curled from the lodge chimneys, blending with the cold mountain air. Children laughed somewhere near the creek, their voices rising and falling like birds sown beneath the snowy scully. Inside one of the larger lodges, Elon stirred a pot of venison stew, the scent mingling with the crisp smell of pine resin and fresh-cut cedar. Her cheeks were flushed from the fire. A woven blanket draped over her shoulders, dyed in earth-tone tones the elder women had taught her to create. Her life here had changed her, made her stronger, made her softer, though, and made her whole in ways she never expected. Baying here, a faint coo broke through the quiet. She turned toward the cradle, simple wooden one Daniel had carved by hand. Inside lay their son, barely 6 months old, ground-shaked and warm against the fur-lined bedding. The boy kicked his tiny feet and reached up toward her, gurgling with delight. Elaine scooped him into her arms, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Easy there, little hawk, she murmured. Your papa will be back soon. As if summoned by her words, the lodge flap lifted, letting in a breath of cold air and the tall silhouette of the man she loved. Daniel stepped inside, shaking snow from his braids. He has found her first always. Irene softened into a smile so warm it could melt the frost from any window. You both look cozy, he teased, crouching beside them. His fingers brushed the baby's cheek. He takes after you, you know that stubborn tilt of the chin. Eileen laughed softly. No, that's all you. Daniel touched her arm, lingering just long enough that a quiet warmth bloomed between them. Outside, the wind carried faint bells from the children's play. Tonight was a special night. The village's winter celebration meant to honor family, memory, and the spirits who guided them through the darkest months. And for a Lent, it was something more. A full year since everything changed. A full year since the night Daniel knocked on her door. It rose and walked to the small evergreen tree they had decorated together, and not to her old traditions, woven now with his tiny wooden carvings hung beside dried berries and strings of polished river stones. A little star of woven willow sat at the top. It traced the star lightly before turning back to her. "Hard to believe," Daniel said softly, "that a year ago we barely knew each other. I almost froze on your porch." "You didn't look like a man who froze easily," she teased. "I didn't," he admitted. "Not until I saw you." She felt heat rise to her cheeks the same way it had that first night. Funny how the heart remembered, even when a whole year of life stood between then and Claire's throat, now. Daniel reached for her son. "Maggie?" "Of course." She placed the child in his arms. The boy squealed happily, gripping one of Daniel's braids in his tiny wit. Daniel chuckled. "Strum one. Ella swing an axe before he can walk." "Not if I can help it," Alan said. "Let him be a child first." Daniel's smile gentled. "Ella have that chance. That's something we both can give him." Anne stepped closer, resting her head against Daniel's shoulder. The fire cracked dully. Snow drifted past the small smoke hole above, catching the light like drifting sparks. "Daniel," she whispered. "I need to tell you something." He stiffened slightly, turning to her with concern. "What is it?" She lifted her face to his. Bright firelight danced in her eyes. "I used to think love happened only once in a lifetime," she said. "That after Nada died, I'd never feel anything again. But love, it doesn't replace. It doesn't erase. It grows." Daniel's throat worked. Emotion tightening his voice. "Ellen. Natada was a good man," she continued softly. "And he loved me. But he also trusted you. And I think," her voice trembled, "I think he knew you were meant to be part of my life somehow." Danielle puffed her cheek, thumb brushing her skin tenderly. "Sometimes I still wonder if staying was the right thing." "It was," she whispered. "For both of us." The baby cooed, waving his arms as if to agree. Daniel laughed under his breath, pressing a kiss to his son's head. A quiet peace settled around them, thick as the warm furs beneath their feet, gentle as snowfall outside. When the firelight flickered brighter, Daniel wrapped an arm around Ellen's waist and pulled her close. "Kung ban namuk," he murmured using the Apache accented English that sometimes was softly into his voice. "We found each other." Elaine smiled and nestled against him. "Naredi, and he brought you to me." Daniel closed his eyes, resting his forehead against hers. "Then I will honor him," he whispered. "By loving you the way he would want a lifetime's worth and more." Aline leaned into him. Their son nestled warm between them, while the snow drifted softly outside, and the winter celebration began somewhere beyond the pines. Their family, small, imperfect, fiercely bound by love, glowed in the orange firelight, a second chance shaped not by loss, but by the courage to love again. And so beneath the quiet winter scheme, their love endured. Proof that even in the harshest frontier, hearts can find their way home again. If this tale touched you, please hit subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment so I can keep bringing more stories to life. Thank you all for listening.